And they ended up finding themselves in this whole irony, and it's just kind of amusing.
I think that most people vote Democrat, they vote Republican, because they don't see any alternative. And it seems to me that the challenge of our time is to wake people up, is to go outside of the Democratic and Republican Party, to talk about the real issues, healthcare, the fact, the growing gap between the rich and the poor in this country, the bipartisan foreign policy by which we spend $300 billion on military while we cut back on programs for the elderly, healthcare, housing. I think if you ask people whether, just recently what's been coming up in terms of the congressional pay raise, here you have a Congress which is giving themselves a 50% pay raise, is proposing to do that when they haven't raised the minimum wage in 10 years, and they've cut back on a whole variety of programs for working people and poor people. So I think that what has to happen in communities around this country is articulate the issues, have the guts to stand up to the people who own your community, who dominate the two major parties, and you'd be surprised at the results you'll get.
The other parties do talk about housing, they talk about health care, they talk about those issues. Tell me what makes your approach different.
Well, I should point out that not only have I been elected mayor of Burlington 4 times, I recently ran for Congress in November, and I lost the election. But in doing so, we put together a really very exciting campaign. We had 500 volunteers, we had 2,300 Vermonters contributing to the campaign, and I lost. The fellow who won, Peter Smith, got 41%, I got 38%, and the Democrat came in third with 18%. And what it showed, it seemed to me, is that at least in Vermont, people are prepared to go beyond the labels of Democrat and Republican and respond to a call for radical change in this country. So what are the issues? We talk about housing. Well, the issue in terms of housing, the issue in terms of health care are not complicated. In terms of health care, the United States of America today is one of 2 industrialized nations in the world that does not have, in one form or another, a national health care system which guarantees health care to all of its people without out-of-pocket expenses. The other nation that lacks a national health care system is South Africa, which tells us that we might want to think about moving in a different direction. All right? And the issue in terms of health care, very important issue, and I talk about it a lot in Vermont. Should the health care system be run, as it presently is, basically to guarantee significant profits to the drug companies, to the hospitals, to the medical equipment suppliers, to the insurance companies, or should we try to provide the best quality of health care that we can, including a lot of preventative health care, in a nonprofit type of way?
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA. Special Sunday program. What should we do? I'm trying to think of the soundboard for this. Special Sunday program of the Majority Report. We're broadcasting from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
And of course, the extended team, super producer David Slavic, Vic Viana. Close-ish? Nick Vana? Vic Viana.
Vic Viana.
Vic Viana. He's our video maestro. He's coming and hanging out with us for the post game. Artesia in the extended. Artesia's not here, but here in spirit. Part of what make things happen on this show. And of course, also Forrest. Jam-packed Sunday show for you. Adom Getachew. She is author of. Excuse me, I don't have it in front of me.
Worldmaking After Empire.
Worldmaking After Empire. We're talking about colonialism, decolonization, the third world project of the 60s and 70s, how it became undone. And we're touching on iconic leaders from Kwame Nkrumah to Michael Manley. Then Derek Davison is joining us. He has a great new project which you want to get acquainted with. And we're going to talk about what WikiLeaks revealed in 2011. Let's remember the crimes that were documented by this case. In fact, the charges of Julian Assange have nothing to do with 2016. They're about the empire exposure of 2011. Also, why was a massive loan just freed up for the Ecuadorian government right after this happened? So there's some Ecuadorian and regional dynamics we'll get to with Derek Davison. Plus, of course, the Shoutout Ari Melber, understanding the stakes of the Assange case, regardless of what you think of Assange. In the post game, we're going to finally do that AMLO deep dive. It's ready. We're going to inaugurate a new segment called Bad. And bad is Nancy Pelosi, as we once again need to get Ilhan Omar's back from the incitement and political terrorism of the right and the facilitation, political timidity, and absolute lack of ethics of the center and the Democratic leadership. Also, props to Tulsi Gabbard for having Ilhan's back, as well as, of course, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. We're going to get to that, plus a Sudan update, the new version of the Debunk with Ben Burgess, and a whole hell of a lot more on the postgame. But first, let's start with some news that dropped this past week. And of course, the news I'm talking about is that Bernie started at the bottom and now he's here. Bernie Sanders wrote a best-selling book after the 2016 campaign. It sold incredibly well, and now he is a millionaire. And the reaction to his being a millionaire reveals almost every sort of not only pathetic political analysis, but the sort of just incredible lack of political sophistication and maturity of so many in the United States who are supposed to actually play a professional political role. Now, look, obviously people like Think Progress are going to go after him. Organizations like Think Progress and various weird Twitter pundits and TV personalities with a bizarre axe to grind and weird fixation on him. But the fact that there is a fixation on his personal income at the expense of structural understanding and these kind of basic, silly points about his supposed hypocrisy reveals that there is a whole mass political and media class in the Democratic and political party that doesn't have a clue as to how to think economically or structurally, which is actually really disturbing, even though it's kind of funny and pathetic to watch. If it were only a matter of being Bernie Sanders is a millionaire, so what? If it were only a matter of his being a hypocrite, but Bernie has been consistent on issues throughout his entire life. In fact, he's proposing a plan that will significantly increase his taxes. Howard Schultz is given unending airtime, even though everybody does not like him, to promote plans that will guard his billions in wealth. Bernie's still for Medicare for all. He wants higher taxes on the rich. He wants increased worker protections. Came from the bottom, now we here. The whole crew's here, taking Jane to Malta. This argument by capitalists that socialists must live in rags is as old as socialism itself. It serves two purposes. One is to discredit socialists if they have money to wear nice things, and two, to present socialism as an idea that it wants to reduce everyone into poverty. Distorting socialism into some aesthetic practice is exactly what our opponents want to do, because it makes socialism unattractive as well as unattainable. Think Progress, of course, exemplified the stupidity of this line of attack. They've jumped on this story with a strikingly bizarre hit piece where they not only attacked Bernie Sanders for being, quote unquote, a hypocrite for being a millionaire, but they also made fun of him for not being a millionaire in the first place. In fact, the hatred of these types of people for Bernie Sanders is so bizarre and misplaced, they can't even keep their target in order. And I want to just say, as someone who vigorously opposed Hillary Clinton as a candidate, because I vigorously oppose right-wing politics, I vigorously oppose austerity, I vigorously oppose coups in Honduras or interference in Haiti, any variety of other policies, from bankruptcy bills to Iraq invasions, where I just look at things differently than Secretary Clinton. There was undoubtedly a segment of people on the left who developed a totally unhealthy fixation on Hillary Clinton and would go out of their way to hate her, even beyond, frankly, her relevancy. And you see this very mirrored and very paralleled in the case that these bizarre people in the media class have against Bernie. It's very weird that a nice grouchy old Jew who wants you to have health care could evoke this much hatred in you. It's weird. Not saying you need to support him, but hating Bernie Sanders, unless you've had like a personal experience with him, I don't even know. I mean, it's just weird. And nobody's had these experiences. Like, everybody says, like, yeah, he's fine. Later, the group released a video implying that Bernie Sanders is admitting the word millionaires from her stump speech, as if Neera Tanden is suddenly worried that Bernie Sanders is toning down his class warfare rhetoric. Now, to put it simply, Bernie Sanders made some money selling a book. Good for him. He hasn't spent his life plundering the working class incomes. Like the slumlord Donald Trump, or making massive speaking fees from Goldman Sachs, like who will remain nameless, and also basically many other frontline Democrats. What he has done is spend his life fighting for working people and making this society a more just place. Whether it's champagne socialism, AOC's lipstick, or now Bernie's book sales, capitalists and those who benefit from capitalism will always push the ridiculous notion on socialist politicians because they cannot beat our vision. So they try to obscure it, scandalize it, and outright lie about it. And in the end, we will win. The real plan was, ever since I was a child. I wish I could get the Goodfellas music for this, actually. It's like, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be rich. Nothing drove my passions and interests more than making money. But I saw my friends go onto Wall Street and have to work incredibly hard because the only thing that exceeded my desire to get rich was my hatred of labor and work of any kind. But I developed a long-term plan. First, move to Vermont. Be involved in obscure third-party left-wing politics. Don't make a proper salary until you're in your 40s. Then have a totally marginal political platform which identifies all of the most important issues and injustices of the day, but you were mocked and ridiculed for having them. Then in 2016, run a totally improbable grassroots insurgency, which is hugely successful because you're talking about the actual problems in our society. And then finally is where the payoff comes in. When you're in your mid to late 70s, you write a goddamn book and you become a millionaire. That was always the point. I will see you in Malta. I don't even know, man. That's just so breathtakingly stupid, that take about Bernie.
I feel like I have to honor my previous rhetoric, namely eat the rich, and say now I want to cannibalize Bernie Sanders.
I think Bernie's probably more worried about it than we are, frankly.
It seems like it, yeah.
He's just like, I
hate this.
It sold well.
I saw my
fuck do you want
I saw
from
my
me?
bank statement. I needed to take a shower.
Made money. It's disgusting. I'll tell you what's really disgusting is standing for rich people. You know, like that is the subcategory I will never understand, is of people who are like, you know, don't have the wealth themselves, but somehow like, it's awesome that Clinton did those speeches to Wall Street and Hillary, and, you know, Bernie's a loser and a hypocrite. It's like the only way you should be running that game is if you yourself are personally a multimillionaire. Other than that, you're just a chump and a stan and a sucker. Like the entire Libertarian Party and all non-ultra wealthy people that vote for Republicans.
Wants to do really well. As everyone wants to do really well.
Exactly. Everyone wants to do really well, which is why you go to a rural state, you start in third-party politics, and then you write a book when you're a senior citizen. It's how you make money. That was always the plan. All right, guys, let's get to the shout-out. To the shout-out. Creepy. Shout-out. Weird. DJ Danarchy, the sonic mastermind of the entire TMBS experience. Much appreciation to him.
Infrastructure. No bumps in the road.
This is out of control. That's creepy.
He's saying that DJ Danarchy provides a no bumps in the road sonic experience for us.
Yeah, that's what it's like in the club. No bumps in the road.
Exactly. All right, so look, I'm really into credit where credit is due and expanding out the coalition. Ari Melber on MSNBC has exactly the right take on the charges against Julian Assange. And let's just be really clear again. He is charged with hacking a password. Now, by the way, if you read the indictment, which I actually have, there is no evidence that is presented of the actual hack. The closest they have is Assange saying, I put some work into it and no luck. What they do document and have in the indictment are things like standard journalistic protocols, like he shared Dropbox with Chelsea Manning, like he used Signal and other encryption things, and he service devices, and he worked to preserve Chelsea Manning's anonymity. These are all journalistic best practices, period. So, we'll see Ari Melber really distill this, but I mean, I think there is I want us to also not forget the really important things that WikiLeaks did reveal in 2011. I also have no doubt that there's a huge amount of intelligence agency interest in, presenting a brand and an image of Julian Assange. I also have been hugely publicly critical of Assange, and I'm not shying from that at all. I just don't think that, frankly, that's the time to emphasize it right now. So, and none of these charges relate to 2016, regardless of what you think of those activities. Ari Melber puts this together really well. Let's watch this.
Journalists would, if the Trump administration can set a precedent of indicting and jailing publishers, the press, for information they publish in a situation where the publisher did not allegedly steal anything themselves, but mostly talk to the people who did, well, I'm telling you tonight, that precedent might later be used against other publishers who maybe did less, because that's how precedents work. Historically, when governments want to jail journalists, they don't start with the most popular ones. They start often with the most reviled, the ones that are the easiest to make some sort of example out of. Now, today's indictment of Assange isn't about 2016 or anything recent. It's a single charge of conspiracy to hack in 2010.
That's it. That's exactly it. It's a single charge of a conspiracy to hack in 2010. And as I've said, if you read the indictment, it does not in any way demonstrate any specifics of that one particular aspect of the charge. What it does have is multiple sort of areas of the indictment which would cover any form of investigative whistleblower-driven journalism writ large. Now, from what we know publicly, and Glenn Greenwald stated this multiple times, and he's, of course, a fierce critic of the Obama administration generally, and particularly on the Obama administration's record on whistleblowers, which was terrible. It was a incredibly aggressive anti-whistleblower administration. But from all publicly available information, the Obama administration did not actually charge Assange. They stepped back from that with regards to the disclosures of the Manning cables, which we'll get to later. But let's not forget, this revealed global war crimes by the United States. It revealed the interference in countries from Madagascar to Haiti. This was real. It's incredibly important stuff. And, again, everything about Assange is secondary to that. And maybe Assange, look, I'm going to table all of that for now. But that's the bottom line. It is a threat to journalism. And the first set of disclosures that these charges are related to were very important disclosures. All right. We're going to do a little pitch, and then we're going to go get to Adom Getachew. So, guys, tickets are absolutely flying. The surge has kicked in that I promised, like over 20 tickets sold a day type numbers, which is pretty unusually high for this type of thing.
Records all over the place.
They're going all over the place, and many people are acknowledging it. And part of it obviously is because now the Young Turks muscle is in on this. So you're tired of hearing us pitch the April 20th live show at the Bootleg Theater with Waz, Nando, Anna, and the whole crew. But let's check out Anna Kasparian doing it, and then go to the Bootleg Theater, snag your tickets as soon as you can. Do it now.
So I'm going to plug something that I'm doing. So Michael Brooks is awesome. I love his show. We're good friends, and he's going to be in Los Angeles to do a live show. And I'm really lucky in being part of it. He asked me to be part of it. And if you are a member, you're actually going to get an opportunity to win a free ticket. So again, this is the Michael Brooks show. He does a lot of really great in-depth analysis on international news. I think better than anyone I've seen in progressive media, to be quite honest with you. Totally again, this is going to be in Los Angeles. It's the Michael Brooks show live in LA. It's going to be at the Bootleg Theater. And again, if you are a member, an activist member specifically, check your inbox, because it'll give you instructions on how you can sign up to try to get a free ticket to this event.
All right. So of course.
All right. Wow. It's going to be fun.
On April 20th.
You want to get the JR April 20th?
I didn't say anything.
I'm going to have to wait until after the live show to partake in 420.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, I just want to say we're lucky to have Anna, and I can guarantee you there are at least 2 people in the studio who will not be waiting till after the show to partake in 420. But we'll see you there. We're really excited about it. Of course, become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show today. We'll be providing lists soon of all of the illicit histories and primers and all of the just extremely extensive extra content you get. To be clear, for $8 a month, you get all of the shows, all 3 shows a week, and the Discord community. For $21 a month, you get about 2 calls a month. And then over 30, first of all, you're being an MVP and helping us do what we do. And then there's some additional kind of roving things that folks get on that level as well. So just to be really clear about the tiers, not going to hit it that much this week, but become a patron, spread the word, patreon.com/TMBS. I'll get to that later. Patreon.com/TMBS. Also, do we have the Brazil Wire link? So obviously we spend a lot of time talking about Brazil on this show. And for all of the reasons that I always state, from the profound injustice of the political imprisonment of Lula, the strategic importance of Brazil in the region, the U.S. role in the catastrophe that is taking place in Brazil right now, as well as the fact that Brazil, in addition, of course, including Lula, but in addition to Lula, has many really powerful and smart and insightful and incisive and incredibly brave voices on the left that are never given a hearing, or seldom, if ever, given a hearing in English language and really type of any kind of Anglo media. The Brazil Wire, edited by Brian Mayer and others, it's an incredible team. They're in Brazil. This is just an indispensable resource. I follow this story closely, obviously, so I read it every day, and I recommend everybody does too. And they've just released a book called The Year of Lead. And I was honored to be asked to write a foreword to this book. This book has essays by political strategists for the PT, by activists, by Lula's former foreign minister, as well as his attorney. This covers the trajectory of 2018 and the predicament we are in now. I'll just read a little bit from the intro, just briefly. Again, this isn't really that new, but I'll just to you if you've been watching the show. But over the past year or so, I've covered Brazil, the Workers' Party, the rise of Jair Bolsonaro, and the political imprisonment of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva extensively. I've done this for several reasons. First, Brazil, like any other place in the world, matters in and of itself. It has many great activists and voices on the left, powerful examples of leadership and organizing that are almost never given any attention in the English language press, let alone the constant failures of prestige outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, and Guardian to even report the story emanating out of Brazil over the last several years properly and objectively, particularly the judicial coup that removed Dilma Rousseff from power in 2016 and the lawfare and imprisonment of Lula da Silva without any material evidence. Lula is an iconic and historic figure. Actually, scroll down a little bit. There's one other point I wanted to get to. I also, this is the thing that, again, I think this is relevant for everybody. I also find Brazil to be a powerful case study in how far-right politics works in today's world, and the misuse of corruption politics as a doorway for the fascist far-right to take power. Even in the United States, Trump's quote-unquote drain the swamp message, which favored vague, generalized complaints about corruption instead of a system-wide critique of capitalism, is easily harnessed by far-right figures to delegitimize left-wing activists, unions, and left political leadership, and so on. So obviously we'll have the links. I'd really recommend everybody order this book and get up to speed on this situation. It's hugely important. We'll be right back with Adom Getachew on the Michael Brooks Show. Am I on? Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Adom Getachew. She is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Chicago and author of Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. Adom, thank you so much for returning to the show.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So let's start. This is about a 40-second montage of Michael Manley, who is a kind of iconic Jamaican prime minister. He served in the 70s and the late 80s and early 90s with very different political profiles. This is from a time when he was a leader in this third world project that you've documented so well in this book. And I just want to give people, I guess, a sense of Manley, but maybe also some of the sense of the sort of broader focus of this project. So we're going to play about 40 seconds of this, and then Adom, I'll throw to you.
Okay, great.
The world. Say now, why are we taking this risk to anger the United States of America? And the answer is this: we are not angering the United States of America. They are angering themselves. They are not going to tell me what relationship I have with Fidel Castro. We have that friendship with Cuba as part of a world alliance of third world nations that are fighting for justice for poor people in the world. And I tell you as the party leader, as long as this party is in power, we intend to walk through the world on our feet and not on our knees.
Adom, What's going on there, and how do those clips, I mean, I picked this for a reason, obviously. I feel like it really reflects what you have documented in terms of the decolonization process and the types of leaders in the Caribbean, Africa, Latin America that emerged.
Yeah, great. It's a great clip to start with, partly because it stages one of the most important interventions that Michael Manley and others would make, which is to recast the terms of the post-World War II divide in terms of a global North and global South, right? So Manley, in that brief clip we heard, pits himself against the United States in solidarity with Cuba. And he makes this argument that this solidarity with Cuba is about a struggle for justice for poor peoples around the world. So what he does in this moment, as he would do in other moments of his political career, is recast the Cold War divide, is resist and reject the Cold War divide of East and West to center a North-South divide of kind of former colonies and a North Atlantic world that benefited directly from the imperial project. So what I try to do in the broader book project is look at African and Caribbean intellectuals and statesmen beginning after World War II and into the 1970s, who would make this argument that decolonization, the achievement of self-determination, required really transforming the relations of political, economic, and legal relations between global North and global South. So that's what we hear Michael Manley staging in that brief clip for us.
And you also make the point that this process of decolonization, in contrast to the sort, because it's sort of like absorbed history that like, oh, well, through some sort of combination of like, maybe, oh, there was a little bit of activism, but also it was sort of like, you know, these European empires were kind of like winding down and there was this transition in the global system. So there was like an inevitability to decolonization, whereas you're actually really recentering the fact that this was incredibly radical. It was not inevitable at all. And it also, even though, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously there's more receptivity in the Soviet Union than in the United States to these movements, but it still challenges both sides of that equation because it is saying like we want to exist out of the superpower like dynamic.
Yes, that's right. So one of the big interventions the book tries to make is to challenge the kind of received reading of decolonization as a straightforward, inevitable transition between empire, from a world of empires to one of nation states. So there's a variety of ways that our narrative captures this. So as other historians have pointed out, the very term decolonization was actually coined by European intellectuals to sort of make it appear as if, like, rather than marking the defeat of empire, decolonization was just the straightforward culmination of the imperial project. So they would never have to kind of assume the posture of defeat, right? And a second place maybe we can see this is, say, in the language of UK Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who would say, the wind of change is blowing over Africa, right? And so here, too, we see a kind of naturalistic metaphor to describe this process as if it were inevitable and as if it wasn't very disruptive also, as if it wasn't transformative. So Nkrumah would have two different, I'm going to switch to Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana to show you a little bit how even in the language they use, this set of actors challenged this naturalistic metaphors that kind of made it appear as if decolonization was inevitable. So in his 1965 neocolonialism, Nkrumah would kind of lament the fact that decolonization had just been reduced to this, what he called a transfer of sovereignty from colonialists to African statesmen, right? Mm-hmm. And he would say, in response to Harold Macmillan's wind of change, that decolonization is a hurricane that's kind of radically disrupting and tearing down all the bastions of colonialism. He said it could only occur in a revolutionary framework, right? And so this kind of, I argue that decolonization was really a radical rupture. It was a kind of an assault on the post-war settlement. So something like the right to self-determination emerges in the UN context after 15 years of struggle, right, in which, European imperial powers actively resisted the effort to include a right to self-determination within the human rights covenants we get in the 1960s. Another moment of struggle where Manley would be actually very important would be the effort to get a new international economic order in the 1970s. So these projects were real challenges to the kind of post-war international order that the United States had worked to build. And I think what you say about the Soviet Union is quite right. I mean, in many ways, the Soviet Union was an important strategic ally of the post-decolonization project, would vote in favor of the various, sometimes co-sponsor some of this, like resolutions in the UN say that we're putting forward the right to self-determination. But I do think it's important to think of the project that anti-colonial leaders are engaged in as really a kind of attempt to sketch out an alternative trajectory. And this stems in part from an earlier 1930s moment of the kind of limits and failures of the Communist International. So during the interwar period, a number of black anti-colonials were deeply involved in the Communist International and saw themselves saw that as the forum and the space in which this project of decolonization would take place. So one person that's really important in that story is the Trinidadian Marxist, George Padmore, who would then go on to be an advisor to Kwame Nkrumah. So part of what happens in the 1930s is the Soviet Union increasingly abandons the kind of Communist International model. The space for anti-colonial thinkers to use that context for their own struggles gets closed. There's a purge that kind of forces George Padmore and other black communists out. So there's a real sense after the war that we need to create a different kind of a black international, if you will, an anti-colonial international that doesn't abandon Marxism but seeks to think about a kind of alternative spaces and forums to the Communist International.
So that's interesting because so it still is trying to synthesize like the global Marxist project, but then account for the specific failings of the Soviet Union and the specific challenges of Africa, as an example. But on the other hand, this also predates like a leader like Thabo Mbeki, right, would come much later on, obviously, and in some ways, I think be really intellectually influenced by the leaders you're talking about. And he also was was certainly kind of like, very historically minded leader. And then his African Renaissance, though, very clearly was like economically totally within the 1990s global capitalist order, but it had like a very specific rhetoric and idea of like cultural liberation. But in this case, you're talking like this is still like a synthesis of both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think many of the thinkers I deal with are very much influenced by Marxist thinking, by the Russian Revolution. I mean, that becomes an exemplary model that kind of shows what might be possible. After World War I, W.E.B. Du Bois would say, the one good thing that came out of this war is the Bolshevik Revolution, which showed to the world that the real democracy means democracy of the working people. And then he kind of makes this claim that what will carry this revolutionary project forward is the, colonial working class, right? The working classes of the world. And you see that, that kind of, the inheritance of a kind of, kind of a Marxist project, a communist project, it gets reformulated, but it persists. And one of the things a series of Black Marxists would be very importantly try to do, beginning in the interwar period, is to try to trace out the specific trajectories of the economies of these colonial societies, right? The mechanisms by which colonialism produces divergent trajectories, forms of colonial dependence, transforms peasant life, etc. So that what part of the argument is that we have to think about economic transformation in the specificity of these particular contexts. The second part of this project, I think, one thing, again, taking the Marxist insight of a kind of the global character of capital seriously, is to think with this idea of an international division of labor and to imagine the colonial world itself as the working classes of the world. So again, going back to the clip which we opened with, part of what Manley is saying when he says we have this global alliance with Cuba is this argument he and others would develop in the 70s that imagine the whole world as in some ways a factory shop, right? A factory floor. And imagine that Cuba and Tanzania and Jamaica and these societies actually functioned as the working classes of the global economy. So imagining class solidarity as a form of third world solidarity by the 1970s. I mean, what's interesting, I think, and you're mentioning of Thabo Mbeki and indicates this already, and as you alluded to in your opening too, that Manley's the later transformation when he comes back into office after the 1980s. You can see the ways in which also again how this project is tied to the Soviet Union, or how the Soviet Union's presence made possible these kind of radical imaginings. The failure, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the triumph of a kind of neoliberalism in the late 80s really transforms the conditions in which of what is possible. So by the time Manley returns to office, or by the time South Africa, the ANC overcomes apartheid in 1994, the terms of the debate have significantly narrowed, right? The sense of political possibility is much smaller in that period than it had been in the 30 years prior.
Well, we'll get to that reversal. And I think also, in addition, I mean, you just summarized the Soviet dimension really well, but I think you also really document, and I put your book in relationship with, Quinn Slobodin's book on the sort of creation of this global market order, not as, again, actually it's another counter naturalization project, because it isn't just oh, let's just unleash the market and let it do its thing. It's actually a very specific way of writing the global rules that favor basically multinational corporations and capital, essentially, at the expense, in fact, of the global shop floor, and increasingly not only in Africa and Latin America, but really, now it's some ways these policies have migrated back to where they emanated from, right? And we see this in these decimations across the board. But before we get there, and maybe a good way of bridging it is you talk really specifically about that these leaders, in addition to their understanding of how the world worked and their global solidarity, that they turned to this entirely new set of, or not entirely new, institutions that they were creating themselves, or they tried to leverage and recreate the United Nations as a vehicle for this kind of politics. And that was the sort of where the rubber met the road of this effort.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I mean, I think Quinn Slobodian's book, Globalists, is a nice counterpoint to this book, because in some ways I think one of the things we should think about framing the post-war period is not as nationalist projects against internationalism, but really very competing conceptions of what the international order ought to look like, what it was supposed to guarantee, right? And so the set of figures I look at, again, come into the post-war period having developed an argument that empire is really a structure of international racial hierarchy. It doesn't matter, simply receiving national independence would not actually guarantee you independence and equality in the international sphere. And exemplary for them in this case was the instance of, Liberia, Ethiopia, and Haiti, all independent Black states, had been independent and recognized since the interwar period. But in the 20th century, Haiti would be under U.S. occupation for 19 years. Liberia was basically a protectorate of the United States and almost subject to military intervention. And of course, Ethiopia would be invaded and occupied by Italy in 1935. So they come with this acute sense that the liberal international order as it exists actually perpetuates hierarchy, perpetuates legal hierarchy by creating unequal relations between states or unequal membership for states. It perpetuates economic dependence because these post-colonial or colonial societies are basically producing primary goods for the market, and that this economic dependence means that they can't ever be politically independent, right? They're always subject to the vagaries of the international market and to the kind of encroachments and interventions of powerful states. So this is the kind of problem that they want to kind of overcome. And they do a couple of things. One is to try and transform the UN structure itself, right? And how do they do this? I alluded to this earlier, but they try to make sure that there is actually that sovereign equality or equal membership can be a central part of the UN. So the right to self-determination is one effort at guaranteeing this equal membership. The right to self-determination is a claim that there can be, self-determination is, in their words, the first human right. There can't be any precursors or arguments about backwardness, underdevelopment that prevents people from securing their self-determination, from being independent, right? And if that's the case, and if all peoples have that right to self-determination, there should be equality of membership for states within the UN system, right? And so this claim of kind of legal equality would manifest in these efforts to either transform this membership in the Security Council, or to try and to make the General Assembly, where there was equal decision-making power, the site of kind of legislation. To imagine that the General Assembly, where there was one vote, one state, the parliamentary power of this new post-imperial world order. The second project that they're engaged in, and I think this is really important because, we tend to read anti-colonial nationalists as just straightforwardly defenders of the nation state, right? People who wanted kind of non-intervention, who were committed to the sovereign state model. But the second project that they're involved in is this effort to create regional federations. Ghana's Republican Constitution of 1960 has a clause in it that says, once we create a union of African states, we will surrender our sovereignty to the regional federation, right? In the West Indies, before Trinidad or Jamaica gained independence in 1962, 10 Anglophone Caribbean states actually constituted a federation with a constitution, a parliament that sat in Port of Spain between 1958 and 1962. So these models, although they failed, what they were trying to do with these models of regional federation was to basically create larger, more diverse economies that would be less dependent, that would gradually be less dependent on kind of the external market, right? So if Jamaica on itself was a small economy that couldn't, or Trinidad was a small economy that couldn't undergo the process of development on its own, like could it do it in these larger formations with a federal state organizing regional development, right? And their model for this, very ironically, was the American Federalists.
Right.
So you see figures like Eric Williams and Kwame Nkrumah reading the Federalist Papers, especially the contributions of Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, as the basis for the kind of economy that they want to build. So that's the second project. And then I think the most ambitious project is the one we've talked a bit about, which is the new international economic order of the 1970s. Now, this project takes that argument about equality, legal equality I discussed a little earlier, and says this is actually now going to be the basis for demands for economic redistribution, right, on the international stage. So the argument here is that if global trade perpetually produces structural inequality, can we create corrective mechanisms, just like the welfare state did in the domestic context, that could balance these forms of inequality, right? And so this involved everything from commodity agreements and commodity associations that would set the kind of prices of the primary goods that post-colonial states were selling, to allowances for nationalization and compensatory financing for when the prices of these goods did fall.
So in the last couple of minutes here, what was the reversal of this project? I mean, I think, again, you can elaborate, but you touched on the fact that clearly, whatever one thinks of the overall nature of the Soviet Union, that obviously there was a lot of political space that was generated just by it existing. What else, though? Like, what was it, particularly in the 80s? Was it this sort of like World Bank IMFization of these countries and that sort of imposition? What leads to, again, in the micro example of, or the case study of Michael Manley, to this unapologetic social democratic perspective and global solidarity and alliance with Cuba? And just to specify, by the late 80s, early 90s, he's really governing Jamaica in a kind of like very third way kind of way, and doing his best. There's one New York Times report from the time, which is like just depressing to read, of him, of an ambassador, sort of a U.S. ambassador, observing one of his campaign rallies, and Manley basically kind of jokingly, but saying like, "Hey, like, what do you think?" And the ambassador giving him the thumbs up, like as a literal, like, physical personification of like, okay, you're not stepping out of the boundaries. And sure, he still did a little bit of redistribution, but very foreign direct investment, privatization, everything else. How did this project get reversed? What happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we have to contend with two parts of why this project failed. One, it is the external story about this project's defeat from the outside, right? Manley's Jamaica is the first country to undergo structural adjustment, right? Way before the Mexican debt crisis, right? So by 1977, Manley has to agree to structural adjustment policies, right? And part of what creates that is precisely the kind of crisis that the NIEO is trying to resolve, which is this question about commodity prices declining, right? So bauxite is a huge export at this time for Jamaica, and it's in part, what leads to the crisis that of the 1970s, in which he has to accept structural adjustment, is both that these prices are declining, at the same time that the state is spending robustly on social welfare provisions, right, on education, on healthcare, et cetera. So, debt levels are astronomical, and the IMF comes in the 1970s. So, that would lead to a whole series of the structural adjustments on what we know to be the the Washington Consensus of the 1980s. There is this very brief and I think important moment in 1980 where Manley and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania have a kind of organized this North-South conference on monetary policy and really try to challenge the way the IMF is organized, the power of the U.S. dollar in international finance. But it's really short-lived, and by then they have no bargaining power or very limited bargaining power, right? And so that's one part of the story that I think is really important. But I think equally important is the domestic side of the story, and by this I mean that, these projects and these leaders were very, while their policies had lots of popular backing, there was lots of political dissent and crises in these domestic contexts, right? In other contexts, in Nkrumah's Ghana, this would lead by 1966 to a coup, a popularly supported coup. So there's a kind of an authoritarianism that begins to emerge within these contexts, a kind of closure of political space for dissent and political opposition. And I think it's really important to pay attention to the limits of their domestic projects and the ways in which these tendencies also undermined the project. So I would say it's both the internal and external story are really important. But I think that, the kind of real, as I was saying earlier, the fall of the Soviet Union and the kind of triumph of the United States and a vision of neoliberalism really sets the stage for not being able to kind of rethink or reimagine the projects of transformation. I'll give one anecdote about this, which goes nicely with what you were saying about the New York Times story on Manley. But in the 90s, Michael Manley exchanges these letters with an economist, the daughter of Carrie Polanyi-Levitt, who's an economist and spends some time in Jamaica. And he writes in one of the letters, he says to her, the NIEO was a mere fantasy. And that's how deeply disillusioned he is by that period of the kind of project he had engaged in. And she's like, no, it wasn't, it's not a fantasy. Like, you were using, your political power, the power of the third world, to make demands of justice and equality. And so you can just tell, I think, in that language of fantasy, the ways in which he had become disillusioned by the prospect of transforming the world order.
Yeah, that's really devastating. I mean, it's a really important book because I also just think that it's so extreme, obviously, in the racism and the repression specifically of the world and the history that you're documenting. But I think, one of the things that we're all, even in much, much, much infinitely smaller ways, we're trying to unlearn some of that sense that there is no other way. And there isn't another way of organizing things. And these are really devastating examples of that. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think we're, the lesson about the world being organized around global white supremacy, a racial hierarchy being a central feature of the modern international order, I think is one that persists in our contemporary moment, right? And so I do think that part of how we navigate navigate this moment and imagine alternatives is to do what they did, which is to be able to think the domestic and international together, to understand that our visions for political and economic transformation within our country have to be accompanied by a vision of what the international order has to look like.
Absolutely. It's a really, really good book. I recommend everybody get it and read it. It's Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, and Adom Getachew. I promise by the next time you're on the show, I will have your name down.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to talk to you.
All right. Much appreciated. Thank you. Everybody, snag that book.
She's great.
She's really good. And while we're complimenting her, I'm not able to kill Skype, but that's okay. We didn't say anything bad. All right. Jesus, this is so fucking annoying. I need to quit it.
Hello.
Start it. Exactly. Hello.
Yes, indeed. Boo. Yes, indeed.
Hiss. It's not letting me quit. Oh no, I got it. It's quitting. All right. Well, speaking of tech difficulties, it's time for it was a tacky joke. All right, David Griscom. No, people love the segment.
Coming at me.
It gets better. I'm just giving you a little taste before Wolf gets here, bro.
I'm ready.
I'm just trying to get you on the canvas a little bit. All right, David Griscom, what do you got for us, man?
Yeah, I'm sure as many other people, we've all been spending the past couple of weeks making sure that we hit our deadline to get our taxes in on time.
Yeesh.
And while most of us working people aren't lucky enough to get good deals like a private jet tax break or anything like that, a decent amount of people, especially middle-class workers, do get tax refunds that come back to them at the end of the year. But I was reading over some really interesting information about what is typically being done with that refund. Due to the inefficient and wasteful medical system in the United States, Americans often are putting off procedures, doctor's visits, and payments until they can get a windfall. For most working Americans, actually their tax refund is the largest single payment that they receive all year. So, unfortunately, it's not surprising to find that a JP Morgan Chase Institute revealed that tax refunds increased the amount of in-person healthcare payments by 10%, which is very significant. So it's not people who are buying themselves television couches or going on vacations. When people are getting this extra money, they're having to use these refunds to take care of basic medical costs. And we're talking about very basic medical costs in most cases. Now, these are followed very closely by making off payments on student loans, card payments, and credit card payments.
Free stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very serious too that just like we're not able to, people aren't able to take a windfall and use it for something beneficial for themselves or even really invest it, that they're basically having to take care of their basic needs. But it's very worrying when you're talking about in the medical industry when more than 1 in 3 working age Americans skipped a doctor's visit or medical test or didn't get a prescription last year because of the cost. So, we're still living in a system where there's 28 million people who are uninsured and an additional 85 million people are underinsured. And, it's something that we really need to keep driving home is that, Medicare for All will save the United States $5.1 trillion. And, and we're not just talking about people on the very bottom of the scale, too. It's like even middle income people, they're ending up having to pay like 15.5% of their income on healthcare payments. It's absolutely ridiculous. And you've seen, I don't know if you guys saw in the Washington Post this week, Jeff Stein broke a story about United Healthcare. And basically there's a leaked video with the CEO, Steve Nelson, who is sort of telling all the people in his company, oh, you might not be seeing us very publicly working to try to kill Medicare for all and all that's been going on. But here I say, quote, one of the things that people have said, we're really quiet, or it seems like we are quiet. We've done a lot more than you would think. So we're living in a system right now where workers are paying a lot of their income in taxes, actually, at the end of the day, and we're getting very little for it. And we have to recognize that just having the things that we have to pay for out of pocket, so having to pay for your own insurance, having to pay obnoxious housing costs, those are all things that the government could be providing at a lower rate. So we should also be thinking about those in the whole ecosystem of what we're considering is like the actual tax rate for most working people. And and just like to top it off, inequality is at the highest levels in the United States since the 20s. The percentage of income that's going to the top 1% is nearly like 22% or something ridiculous like that. So when we're looking at the situation where people now are not even able to make their basic needs to be able to get health care for themselves, to be able to go to the doctor if they have a pain in their chest or something like that, we're in a very, very serious situation. And we need Medicare for all. We need significantly higher taxes on the wealthy. And we also really need to start democratizing profits in this country so that they're not all being sucked up by a few people at the very top.
That's exactly right. And I mean, healthcare is such a clear example of it's a pure parasite industry. There's no argument for it. It's the incentive structure is wrong fundamentally, right? Like there's other areas where obviously our position is democratizing the economy very broadly, but there's other areas where the incentive structure of another product is different. And so it does lead to different arguments. The incentive structure of healthcare industry is to make you pay them and then deny you care. That is how the margins grow. And we're going to need to also start looking very specifically. I mean, I'm sorry to bring his name up because for any of you who even know who he is, it's just sort of depressing. But, look up Dick Gephardt. This is a guy who was a major Democratic leader from the 80s through 2004. He ran, was the Democratic leader of the House, ran for president. He lost. He didn't run a particularly impressive campaign, but was a serious contender. And he was floated as a VP candidate in several cycles. And he cultivated an air of himself as a labor man, as a guy who represented good Midwest populist values. He even critiqued Bill Clinton's corporatism at times. Now, of course, if you looked into his record at the time and realized where he was coming from, I mean, this was basically a very machine hack politician who did things like help usher the invasion of Iraq and the Patriot Act through the House. And, at the end of the day, even though he might have sort of, railed against various trade agreements, the proof is kind of in the pudding in terms of his delivery, even when he did vote the right way. He's dedicated his entire post-Democratic leadership career to lobbying for any company that wants it, including all sorts of health insurance interests that oppose single payer, which was something that he at the very least, kind of tipped his hat to when he was in office, but also every Wall Street bank, the government of Turkey against recognizing the Armenian genocide. But there was a leak of him, I think from about a year ago, of him telling some people at a conference like, hey, single payer ain't going to happen while I'm lobbying. Howard Dean, less egregious, but Howard Dean's another person who traded a progressive reputation and has done plenty of extremely sleazy healthcare lobbying. And with any Democrat in office, I mean, obviously from the great scenario of a progressive who will actually seriously push for this, through a corporatist who will have to kind of spin what they're doing, you're going to have a cavalcade of Democratic staffers and leaders who are going to lobby for these parasite companies to make you sick and them rich. And just one final point. If you listen to the illicit history, and patrons did, Jamila Michner, she's brilliant, of Medicaid in this country. One of the points we got to in the conclusion, though, is that basically, look, unless you're Jeff Bezos, this healthcare system is a threat to you. I mean, even on a far-reaching example, families could be making joint incomes of even like $1 million a year. And you know what? If they have a kid that has a severe medical condition, that all of a sudden could wipe out even that income. So this is a fundamentally unsafe, unjust, profoundly immoral system who works for health insurance CEOs and those disgusting enough to lobby for them. David Feldman, check him out on Twitter. And check out his podcast. He's brilliant. He's actually been putting together videos and podcasts very specifically on the lobbying industry in the health insurance sector and the CEOs of these parasite companies.
And it's United Healthcare is a $240 billion company.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, they have a massive lobbying budget, but wherever there is the profit motive and wherever the government specifically has a lot of weight, you start to see these lobbying budgets get big. Even a company like PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, that wicked company, they spend a ridiculous amount of money on lobbying for a utilities
company.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Not just
for
California lobbying.
Yeah, for like
lobbying.
For like a utility company in California.
Well, it's one of the top 10 biggest economies in the world, and there's a lot of money to make and a lot of corners to cut and a lot of
But you see the relationship
privatize.
there
Right.
Between why we have these industries. Like I would say that PG&E is also another example of a system where having a for-profit system has created a lot of significant issues, including people's lives, including death for folks. And you see the relationship between these systems where you really can't make a good argument for why they should be the way that they are today, right?
100%.
And the fact that there is a very significant correlation, I would argue, between those huge lobbying budgets that are able to keep these afloat, because there's no popular constituency really of people who really, really want PG&E to continue to be a for-profit company. There really are not people who really want the United States to still have a private healthcare system instead of a public healthcare system. There's a question about how we're going to do that, but no one really loves their insurance company.
Those statistics,
beloved private insurance.
Those statistics you said about how the money goes straight into medical costs or like student loans illustrates the problem with basic income too, because basically it's just going to juice the profits for those things that should be decommodified in the first place.
Precisely. That's exactly right. All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to return with Derek Davison, finally getting him back, to talk about WikiLeaks and Ecuador. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Derek Davison. He is a foreign policy analyst and writer. You can, I'm sorry, I always mess his website up, but it's, and that's...
Well, it's new. I switched. So.
Oh, all right. Shoot.
I've got a new site. I'm at Substack. It's called Foreign Exchanges. fx.substack.com.
And there's a huge breaking controversy because I found that out before we went on air, and I just followed the Foreign Exchanges account on Twitter, and I have not got the follow back, Derek.
Oh my God! Well, yeah, you have to. My social media manager is probably, he's a
drunk,
bit of a drunk, yeah,
passed out.
It's a bad scene.
Totally irresponsible. I take my follow to follow ratios very seriously, Derek. So we might want to get on that.
All right, I'll toss a bucket of water on him and get him.
Yeah, get him to wake up. To smack him across the face. Or don't. Or do, Klobuchar him. Fire him for not following me back, and then call several other foreign policy analysts and get him blackballed.
My salad comb needs clean.
Ugh. It's so fucking gross, man. I think Tuesday we're going to do a little, because apparently I'll just tease this a little bit. Did you hear that Amy Klobuchar, apparently the strategy coming out from the campaign is that Amy's going to distinguish herself by showcasing her humor? Okay.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah. She's a joke maker.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's like, and the thing that would be funny is we were talking about in the office is like, if it was actually like, I think Brendan had this idea that like, what if it was like she did like a Gallagher thing, but instead of like watermelon, she's all like, should I throw this stapler at my deputy com's head? Should I? This motherfucker didn't send the press release. And she does all of that. And then it's like, all right. Now, anyways, here's my plan for tax incentives for 3 months of reduced price broadband.
That's a can't lose, I think. That's definitely the way to go.
She and Rahm Emanuel are very similar, I feel, in terms of like these extreme, horrible personalities in the service of like the most terrible piecemeal, like
just the most tepid, kind of business, pro-business.
Just like pro-business consensus.
Centrism, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like you hear about some people who it's like, well, it shouldn't have been like that, but they were really fighting for something. And then it's like, ooh, they were.
What, they were fighting for tax advantage savings accounts.
Yeah.
Ooh.
It's like, if you don't get that press release out, then there won't be a fucking dividends rebate. I'll fucking kill you. Derek, let's talk a little bit about WikiLeaks. And I just want to say, like, I mean, I did it earlier in the commentary, but do you want to touch on just briefly, like, just really specifically, like the idea that this specific charge related to the Manning's disclosures should be self-evidently, unless you are literally a member of the national security state. This has nothing to do with whether or not you think Julian Assange is an asshole. This has nothing to do with whether or not you think he should face charges for other accusations. This has nothing to do with what you think about 2016. This charge is a pure threat to journalism, period.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly intended as retribution for publishing the Manning leaks. I mean, the charge itself is almost, well, I mean, I think arguably at least intended to sort of get around a legal defense that relies on the First Amendment, on press freedom, and charge him anyway, even though the real crime here, as far as the government is concerned, was doing journalism. But they've concocted this hacking charge, which is very questionable to me because there's no evidence that there was any hacking going on. I mean, Assange supposedly, allegedly, tried to help Manning access a government computer using a different login to protect her identity. And that's not hacking. I mean, like, the definition of hacking, I know it's government and nobody really understands how computers work, but you're stretching the definition of hacking like beyond any recognition here, basically, so that you can charge him with a serious offense related to Manning without just coming out and saying, well, he published a lot of stuff that made us look bad, and we want to make him pay for that. So it's a very shady charge. It was when the Obama administration levied it in the first place.
Although they didn't actually, I mean, look, they said all sorts of horrifying things, and there was a reason. I mean, Assange was totally justified in being terrified of being sent to the United States. He's justified being scared of being like black bagged. But they didn't, as far as we know, actually end up pressing these charges that bring this indictment themselves. And they were notoriously terrible on whistleblowers. It actually took till Trump for this specific charge. as far as we know.
Right, but it was out there. I mean, one of the reasons why, there was the charge in Sweden, which is something completely different, and again, gets at, Assange, what Assange is personally or who he is personally, which, is a whole different question. But yeah, part of the reason he sought asylum was in concert with the criminal charges that he was facing in Sweden, the threat that he would wind up being extradited to the United States.
Well, absolutely. Well, that's what I'm saying. He was totally justified in that worry, of course.
Right.
I mean, you had people like Joe Biden calling him a digital terrorist for doing journalism. I mean, people do
you had
forget.
reporters. I can remember. Yeah. I mean, I don't remember specifically, but I can remember reporters at the time talking about like drone striking this guy. I mean, reporters, people who should value the press and the freedom of the press, talking about, man, they should hit this guy with a drone, and just like crazy talk.
Yeah. No, it was insane. And I just want to get to, and I think, again, we could even make a distinction, and I'm not even talking legally. To be honest with you, 2016, I err on the side of being very disturbed by any charges related to any of these things. But I'll just say bluntly, like, I think, and I managed to piss off both Clinton bots and some people who identify themselves as being on the left with this. I thought like most of those DNC emails were giant nothing burgers and told us absolutely nothing new and were entertaining. Like, sure, these people are careerist assholes and they mostly suck. But like, okay, I mean, I don't know if you needed to read a Pizzagate email to know that about these people, these mediocrities in that world. But 2011, what Julian Assange revealed to the world was incredibly important. I mean, you're talking about everything from global war crimes to Fruit of the Loom, getting an assist from the State Department in Haiti to kill minimum wage legislation right in the wake of the earthquake, to all sorts of other nefarious things. And this, I mean, I'll give a warning, this is very disturbing, but this was the big takeaway. This was the collateral murder video that they released of basically a couple of people in a helicopter in Iraq. Obviously, I mean, this is just targeting civilians, period. Let's play it.
Right.
You got about 4 Humvees out along this. You're clear. All right, firing. Line here. When the space line, let me know when you have it. We'll shoot. Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire. Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot. Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now. All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals.
So there it is. Derek, can you talk more about what they revealed?
Yeah, well, I mean, the collateral murder video was one of 2 videos that were in the Manning leaks that basically just, showed the United States military committing war crimes. In this case, in Iraq, there was another incident called the Grenai airstrike or the Grenai massacre, which was a bombing in Afghanistan in Farah province that took place in 2009, in which probably somewhere around 100 to 150 people were killed, civilians, mostly women and children. And, that was the Pentagon does what it always does. It said, well, mistakes may have been made. We're not sure. We tried to minimize. We don't know what happened. But they had video of the strike that they didn't release, and that was part of the dump that WikiLeaks released. It sort of showed this unbelievably horrible war crime being committed. There were a couple of other big document dumps that came out around the same time. One was the Afghan war documents or the Afghan war diary, which were, just a collection of communications and other documents describing the war effort that really made it clear just how bad things were going. I mean, at the time in 2010, 2011, when this was released, there was a sense that things weren't going great, but the Taliban was still contained, and things were okay. But the dump, this Afghan war diary, really made it clear that the war effort was failing badly, and that the Taliban were really resurging. There was another leak of Iraq war documents called the Iraq war logs. Similarly, similar to the Afghan war diary, kind of a collection of military documents and communications. And in this case, it sort of highlighted the brutality of that war, the number, the tens of thousands of civilians who were killed, and the degree to which the United States was directly responsible. I mean, I would argue we're responsible for all of those deaths because we're the ones who invaded and started the war. But just like the ones that the United States was directly responsible for, the people that we, our military killed. So yeah, these were huge, eye-opening things. Shortly after, some of the Manning stuff came out, there was a leak of what's called the Guantanamo files that WikiLeaks put out in 2011 that made it clear the kind of horrible conditions and the horrible treatment that prisoners at Guantanamo Bay were suffering. Just again and again in that couple of year period, things that certainly the United States government did not want to become public knowledge, highlighting the real kind of horrors and excesses of the war on terror, and I would argue. Really valuable stuff. I mean, things that people should have known about, and things that, frankly, other newspapers picked up on. I mean, other news outlets, the New York Times, the Guardian, a number of news outlets picked up on and published. Some of them, the same news outlets now that are, calling for Assange to be dragged back to the United States in chains and and hanged from the Washington Monument or whatever. So it
is extraordinary, right? And I don't mean to be like, I actually think it is a problem when Donald Trump, kicks Jim Acosta out for asking him a question, right? But at the same time, it is incredible that, and a number of people made this point. This isn't unique to me, but just to really underline that there is a chunk of people who would say Trump called Jim Acosta a loser. That's the end of the press. Let's bring Julian Assange in shackles over here and indict him. And by the way, I'll say this again. Not only does the indictment not demonstrate hacking, it includes in the continuum of things like using encryption services and having a Dropbox. If you followed the literal precedent set from this prosecution, it would absolutely implicate every single piece of essentially a journalist working with a whistleblower by definition. By definition, you're going to release documents in a way that is. I mean, what is? I mean, what is? It's a catastrophe that Reality Winner didn't have her identity protected, right? That's horrible. And it's a catastrophe that she's in that situation. That is your job as a journalist. And, it is, I mean, of course, at this point, there's nothing surprising, but it really is like the extreme of the extreme. And it's very interesting to watch this coupled with people engaging in Venezuela coup talk that, people who by the way, they're right. Donald Trump is a racist, monster, horrific, grotesque danger to all humanity. So I would suggest that probably we don't support him in, taking aim at investigative journalism and instigating regime change. Yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, you would think, right?
Right.
No, there was. I mean, the most egregious one to me was the Washington Post editorial board. Now, the Washington Post editorial board, especially on foreign policy, can be a cesspool. But you would think, for a major newspaper whose owner is engaged in some kind of weird personal feud with Donald Trump, where You know, we're told he's being hacked by the Saudis and his personal information is being given to the National Enquirer. All, you know, Trump allies doing this to embarrass him and embarrass the paper and get it to undercut, you know, its, or, you know, kind of step back from its coverage of the Trump administration. Their tagline is "Democracy dies in darkness," and they did an op-ed from the editorial board that's, you know, Julian Assange is not a free press hero and he is long overdue for personal accountability. They had they didn't spend any time kind of interrogating the First Amendment ramifications of this charge. I mean, spent no time really considering how dangerous this is. It was all kind of invective about Assange. You know, he did this, he did that. He's a bad guy. Which, again, I mean, as you said, all fine if that's your view of him. Okay. But you would expect, at least from an outlet like this, that you would take a few minutes to just consider, what does this mean for the business that we're in? Like, what's the precedent that's being set here?
The other dimension to this that I find really disturbing, and I'll just use the latest news to open up the broader conversation, but it was just announced, I believe yesterday, or a couple of days ago. No, actually, this is a report from today. Ecuador just inks a $4.2 billion financing deal with the IMF, and it's announced by Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno. Now, there's a bigger story about this in terms of Moreno, Rafael Correa, who Lenin Moreno is, and also, I would say, the broader kind of U.S.-backed reassertion of far-right forces across Latin America, the reversal of the pink tide, which is a big part of this show. But I mean, talk about the loan and maybe use that as a door to explain just who Lenin Moreno is.
Yeah, I mean, the loans were announced, I think, Friday. So they didn't even wait a couple of days to let things digest before they, you know, up and bestowed something like $10 billion of bailout money on Ecuador. And you know, granted, a lot of it's coming from the IMF and the World Bank, which means a lot of pain and austerity for Ecuador coming up, which you know, is not exactly a good thing. But still, I mean, three of the institutions, there were four institutions in total that put together this $10 billion bailout package. Three of them, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, the United States is the largest shareholder in all three of them and controls you know, vastly more voting power than it even kind of directly holds, because it basically controls most of the European vote. It controls a lot of the Americas votes from places like Canada and elsewhere, and Brazil, you know, which is a large voting member, and especially the Inter-American Development Bank. You know, Jair Bolsonaro isn't going to do anything that Donald Trump doesn't want him to do in that regard. So it's interesting that, and certainly, you know, Moreno has been talking to the IMF and these other institutions for a while about you know, doing a bailout, but I think it's the coincidence is sort of inescapable that, like, the day after, you know, in the hours after he withdrew Assange's asylum, suddenly you see all these institutions that the United States effectively controls, or at least has a great deal of control over, you know, freeing up billions of dollars for the Venezuelan economy. Moreno's an interesting character. I mean, he was Correa's vice president, and then he was nominated in the 2017 election by Correa's party. He had Correa's endorsement and blessing, but he's since kind of shifted right. I mean, he's not as hard right as some other governments in the region, certainly, but you know, kind of in the face of, I think, shifting political ground around him, and with Ecuador running into a little bit of economic challenge, he's kind of gravitated toward the right, the center right or right wing, and he's embracing things like austerity economics and, you know, trying to make nice with the Trump administration. And, you know, he's really done a 180 almost in terms of his own politics.
But I mean, and in some ways, though, it's even more like, I mean, just a little bit of context. I mean, Rafael Correa was actually, I mean, one of the things that was fascinating about the Pink Tide is that these are all very distinct, very, there's a lot of personalities, right? I mean, all of them cut quite a profile, whether it's, Hugo Chavez, obviously, or Lula, or Cristina Kirchner, or Evo Morales, and Rafael Correa was like no exception. And, governed Ecuador in a very interesting way. He did a lot of very significant redistribution. One area of very valid criticism of him actually was definitely in environmental and indigenous rights areas where there was really big problems, because the kind of bigger structural problem of all of these countries relying for social progress on commodities, and in Ecuador's case, it's oil. But on the other hand, he was willing to, probably closer to the sort of Chavez orbit, be very directly adversarial with the usual typical imperial U.S. relationship in the region. And, he said that withdrawing Assange's asylum is like one of the greatest, shames in Ecuador's history. And then just as a button to that, it's not just that Lenin Moreno has, ran as the leader of the party and then made, I think a pretty sharp turn right. It's that there's another case here in Latin America, and in Correa's case, he's in Belgium on a teaching fellowship, but of what looks to be a trumped up kidnapping charge against him. And, Moreno put out an Interpol notice and basically wants Correa to come back and go to jail. And so far, the Europeans have actually not cooperated, because apparently, there's a lot of questions about just how substantive the charges are. But it's really striking that not only is he from the same party and has made this reversal, but he's also following this other pattern. Obviously, most prominently is the case of Lula, but there's, I know less about the Cristina Kirchner case. It might be more substantive, but I think it's very bizarre timing that they're trying to strip her immunity from, her Senate seat when she's gearing up to maybe reclaim the presidency from Macri. And again, the Kirchners did actually deliver some very significant things for Argentina, particularly in terms of liberating it from the World Bank and IMF. So, Moreno's not only, I guess what I'm saying is, it's not just a sort of pragmatic, let's deal with things as they are sort of move. He's chosen to aggressively reverse course. And this is another thing I think that you can't separate the Assange case from, which is that this broader reversal in Latin America, which is bad for progressive prospects.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting in Moreno's case, in all the other cases in Argentina, in Brazil, in Colombia, in all these other places, the switch has come with a change of the party in power. I mean, there's been an election, and the right has been ascendant in the election, and then they've, not only, as you say, not only have they reversed course policy-wise, but they've gone to some lengths to criminalize being on the left, or to criminalize these leaders of the pink wave, to kind of ensure that there's no way they can get back into power. In Moreno's case, I mean, there really hasn't been a shift in party. He's just taken the party over and taken it in the same direction. I think that's the thing that kind of sets him apart. But it is part of regional kind of wave. I think you're right to say that.
And I think disturbingly, like some of the reporting from some of the strategists involved in the left in Ecuador was actually that even some of the kind of indicators where there was some problems in Correa's first term, where maybe there might have been an opportunity for more democratization of the party and sort of more kind of better policies overall, even than Correa, instead of this like horrible reversal that Moreno represents. And, this stuff implicates a lot of things. I mean, even like the fact that Ecuador pulled its funding for Telesur. I think Telesur, again, I wouldn't rely on any one media source in and of itself. But the bottom line is, I think Telesur in particular, I mean, that's a source that you're going to get a perspective from, just as frankly an anti-U.S. imperial perspective in Latin America that you're just not going to get elsewhere in general. I mean, I know obviously like the Real News Network, and then there's, and Democracy Now! And so on, and then shows like this, I think, provide really important comment, and your work, there's really important commentary and analysis, but there wasn't an attempt to say like, all right, if there's all these global news outlets that supposedly represent different geographies and ideologies, we need one that represents the sort of like anti-imperial stance of Latin America. So pulling out of that is also, important in terms of undermining ideology and broader diplomatic efforts. So, I think we can't separate this Assange thing from this big reversal in Latin America and the portrayal of Lenin Moreno.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. I think that's a great point.
Are you going to have your guy follow me back?
I'll, if I can get him out of his stupor, I'll definitely get on it. Yeah.
Are you going to Klobuchar him?
Well, like I said, these combs aren't going to clean themselves. So yeah, I gotta,
it's like picturing Davidson looking up, like, I need something on the early Ottoman period to illustrate this point. And give me my fucking salad comb. I want a salad.
Like whipping big volumes of the Cambridge History of Islam at the guy.
Yeah. Well, I like you see, that's, you can tell Davidson's got comedic chops because of the specificity of the references.
No, I just looked over at my bookshelf and looked at the biggest book I could find.
Whatever works. How can people, what's going on? So, okay, so tell us again, though, about the new way that people can find you and what kind of things you're going to be doing over there.
Yeah, so I'm at, again, it's foreign exchanges at Substack, fx.substack.com. I've got my nightly world news roundups. I'm doing podcasting. I'm doing commentaries, and you can find it at the site. You can follow me or you can follow the site on Twitter at FX_newsletter. You can follow me on Twitter at DW Davison, and lots of ways to track people down these days, I guess.
Much appreciated, man. Thanks so much for doing this. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
Take care. All right, folks. Once again, Skype is not closing, not quitting a call. It's very annoying. All right, here's what we're going to do. We are going to take a break. We're going to go to the post game. And the way you join the post game is by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TMBS. And you get a whole, I would actually say in some ways the content of tonight is a pretty good preview for illicit histories and idea primers. Vic Viana is going to join us. He is our video guy, and we're going to rerun the ad for the illicit histories. The illicit history videos are for $21 a month patrons. It's a whole new thing that you get. You get to help us pick the topics we cover. We'll take your suggestions, and you'll get the videos in about a month in advance. And then in general, we're going to try to release them on the YouTube channel because, again, there is obviously an educational purpose to this stuff, and we want as many people to see and learn this stuff as possible. So I want to thank our guests. Check them out. They're both great, of course, Adom and Derek. And I want to thank everybody in the entire crew. We have a lot to get to in the post game. Join on Tuesday. It's another show because we have the following week off. But on Tuesday, Professor Richard Wolff returns. We're talking about Gramsci and hegemony and whether or not UBI is a good idea. Please definitely buy Brazil Wire's Year of Lead. That's an essential book. And if you haven't yet, grab your tickets. You're absolutely not going to want to miss Anna, Waz, and Nando playing with myself. Who said it? Mussolini or Mark Cuban? New Dave Rubin sketches. There's a lot going on at that show. Get your tickets at the Bootleg Theater. We'll see you with Ben Burgess for the debunk first thing in the post game on the Michael Brooks Show. Thanks, everybody.